Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 12th and final chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes. Here we're going to hear the words of two distinct human beings, the first of which is Solomon, who was a king and a sage, and whose words, orally preserved, were recorded in written form by an anonymous author-editor some centuries after he lived. We have zero clues as to the actual name of the author who recorded his words, but the author editor does leave clues that this was Solomon. So what we would have said would have been orally preserved until then in the same chronological interval, or the approximate one. So it was during the reign of King Solomon that the writings of the words of Moses were first recorded in written form, and an approximate chronological interval distance exists between the recording of the words of Moses and the recordings of Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. So we earlier met the author editor, who we're going to hear from more extensively and most extensively. He writes the first verse of the first book. These are the words of Quoleth, son of David, king in Israel. But so he leaves clues to Solomon. Solomon is not explicitly mentioned as he is in the book of Solomon. The Proverbs of Solomon and the Song of Solomon. But this author, we hear from him again in the final 6 verses. So those words aren't Quoleth's words. Quoleth is Solomon. But from 1:2 to 12:8, everything, if Solomon was Jesus, it would all be written in red. We finally hear from him in the ninth verse of the 12th and final chapter. But before that, we want to get to the material in red, that of Solomon, beginning in the 11th chapter, which establishes the trajectory of enjoying life while you're young and making the most of it and living godly while you are young, because it does not last forever. But even before that, he touches upon some of the uncertainties of life, and he had practical business wisdom, and so he says in the first verse, without reward, you're not automatically guaranteed to a reward if you take a risk, but if you don't take a risk, you have no right, reasonable, or expectation for an reward, and there is time and patience involved in making money. So for example, his in 3-year cycles, his ship sent out and returned back with good. And in the second verse, he advises to be generous while it is in your power to be generous, because you never know. Time and chance happen to all. You may be dependent on the generosity of others if radical revolutionary of fortunes happen. If you are rich. And then he says this in the third verse, and remember the theme of the first 6 verses of the 11th chapter, the uncertainties of life. This is a certainty of life. These are scientifically irrefutable facts. If the clouds are filled with rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it is. You cannot argue with that from a physical, scientific standpoint. Those are facts of life. The more accumulated clouds are the accumulation of evaporated water, and eventually and inevitably enough rain stores in them, and that's when the earth is flooded. And then a tree can't move while it is, and when it falls down, it cannot move either. So where it lives and where it falls is where it remains, or until someone removes it, or nature just takes its course on it. But then he speaks of the uncertain, and then he says, pay attention to the winds and look at the clouds, but only to a farmer must work with nature in order to have nature work for them. Do not spend 100% of your time observing, waiting for ideal conditions, perfect conditions, because they do not exist. So take the risk when there's ample opportunity, because if you had to wait for the perfect moment, you'd miss any chance. And then to the theme of the uncertainties of life, verse 5, as you do not know which way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with the child, so you do not know the works of God who makes all. Solomon argues from the lesser to the greater. These are two things, as early as 1:6, he says the wind, we cannot control it, we cannot contain it, we cannot predict it, we cannot explain it, and even in our scientific age, we are somewhat limited as to how much we understand it. And an even greater mystery is the process of growth in a human life form, which begins as a man's semen and then grows into a fully functioning thing. So in between that time in the mother's womb, the bones grow into the fetus, so that when a baby is born alive, they have bones and they develop them in the mother's womb. But we don't know how that happens. Our scientific knowledge, it can be explained partially scientifically, but just as Paul planted, Apollos waters, and God gives the growth, ultimately is a theological extra. And there's so much more beyond these things. The works of God in their plenary totality, who makes all. He is all. He is the creator. He is the controller. He is sovereign. And finite man, mortal man, cannot explain all of his works. They cannot understand. So there is so much in God's world that we cannot control, far less comprehend. And these imperfections and limitations exist to remind us that he is God and we are man. Verse 6, sow your seed in the morning, and until evening do not let your hand rest, since you do not know which prosper this way or that way. Both alike are good. Seed are designed to grow. That's what their purpose and function are, but there are innumerable external circumstances that can prevent a seed from growing. So the moral of the story is spread generously, just like, give a portion to 7 or 8, and the 8 portion, just do it all day and all night, and get as many seeds into the field as you can, because the odds, the best things in life require hard work, patience, and discipline. Then he transitions into what bleeds into the 12th chapter we're going to cover. Solomon is writing, this is his most mature musings, the works of his latest work. So he wrote the Song of Solomon when he was young, Book of Proverbs in his middle years, and Ecclesiastes when he was old. And if according to the adage, with age comes wisdom, then Ecclesiastes is certainly his masterpiece. And the thing about young people is we have no idea what it's like to be old, but every old person has an idea what it's like to be young. So what they have to say about youth, we should treasure and value and utilize and make the most of. Verse 8, but if a man lives many years, let him rejoice in them all, but let him remember the days of darkness, for they are many. All that is coming is futility. Life is a gift from God, and he wants us to enjoy it and rejoice in it. It's not sinful to enjoy or have pleasure, delight, and satisfaction while we're here, but we have to have good, wholesome, clean fun. And if we live a long life, that is a blessing from God, but not righteousness and longevity of life are not exactly connected. But always remember the days of darkness, the days, not every day is a day to rejoice in or rejoice over or rejoice because. So remember the days of darkness, death, and they are many, and all that coming is futility. So he writes as if this life is all we have. But he immediately rectifies or reverses his stance in the 9th verse. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart be gladdened in the day of your youth, and walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But you know that all these things God's bring you into judgment. So the seeming meaninglessness of life is rendered meaningful because everything we do, how we spend our youth, the decisions we make, the actions we take, the words we speak, the people we help or do not help, the ways that we seek happiness and satisfaction, and the way that our hearts are geared and oriented, all that matters actually. In actually fact, it doesn't die when we die, but it meets the judgment, and it either dies or lives. So the fact of judgment exists. One way of Ecclesiastes is a warning of judgment, but the way of looking at it that I'm personally more inclined to is an invitation to the same. Therefore remove wrath from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for youth and dawn of life are futility. Wrath is the mark and measure of a fool. You can know a fool because they are prone to wrath. They are easily irritated, angry, and infuriated, and they get upset over trivial things. So get rid of, life is too short to be angry all the time or angry over the inconsequential. So get rid of it. Get rid of the source of the anger. And it is ultimately a heart issue. It's not the things going around you. It's the heart. And put away evil. Get rid of evil because, you can there's pleasure in sin for a season. You can get away with it for a little while. But the older you get, the way of the transgressor, the harder it is. Because you ultimately abuse your physical and spiritual life, and a life lived with evil and anger is of course futility, but there is a superior alternative and a panacea to what plagued Solomon's, which the author editor ultimately we can attribute him to. First verse, 12th chapter, lesson itself. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near where you say, I have no pleasure in them. Remember is not nearly strong enough a word as it is translated. As it suggests, it just remembers having intellectual acknowledgement, but remembering in the Hebrew original means pay attention to, heed, listen to, learn from, and live. So he wants us to live God-centric lives in the days of our youth when it matters life. Now the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and it is never never too late until it is, so why wait? So get God in your life now, especially if you are young. Build the foundation. The younger, the better, ideally, because the evil days, the days we live in evil, we are surrounded in evil, but the evil days that he is talking about are what waits beyond us, the days where we have no existence. And the days when we can no longer enjoy life because we are beset by infirmities and just the vicissitudes and the injuries of life, and it saps the life out of it, saps our enjoyment of it. But God can make a difference in our life then if we add him to our lives, make him the centerpiece of our lives now. Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. He's not talking about literal sunlight, moon, stars, and darkens. He's talking about the passing of life, the inexorable advancement unto death. So the sun and the light, before that vanishes, he's talking about light. Light is analogous and equivalent to life in this analogy. And the moon and the stars, these are what set over the sun and the light, are darkened, and then the clouds return after the rain. So he's saying the same thing that he's saying earlier. And the days when the guards of the house tremble, and the housemen shall bow down, when the grinders shall cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows shall become dim. Once more, he's using physical metaphors and analogies. The house trembling is just the weakening of the knees as we get old and infirm, and our strength saps from our body, our physical strength, our mental acuity, just our vitality in life, and we are. This is analogous to a house that does not have the necessary workforce or repairmans to maintain it and uphold it. And the windows become dim. Now he's talking about both the physical, not blindness, but progression towards blindness. As we get older, our vision is no longer what it once was. I had 20/20 vision my whole life until after a 4-year interval without a doctor's appointment, I discovered that I need glasses to read. I don't wear them, obviously, but my vision is not what it used to be, and it's only going to get worse and worse and worse. Our windows shall become dim, the dimmer we get. So enjoy what you can see while you can see it, and as fully as you can see it while you're here. And the door shall be shut in the street, and the sound of grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are bowed down. So once more, the doors shall be shut. He's not talking about literal doors, but, the end of life, the end of existence, and the street when there is no one there, when everything else is a ghost town, when we no longer inhabit a city on earth, and all the daughters, there's no one to sing there. They are all bowed down, so there is no one left. He's talking about the end of our life. He has death in mind. When he is speaking about the need to remember the Creator in life, because while we have life, this life that we have is not going to last forever, so we may as well pay homage, but he does ultimately bring himself to a faithful affirmation, Solomon himself, in the afterlife. Furthermore, they are afraid of what is high and of low places in the way, and the almond tree blossoms, and the grasshoppers become a burden, and desire perishes, for man is going to his everlasting home, and the mourner shall go about the street. Death is a source of fear and consternation, and to paraphrase the first century Jewish philosopher Philo, there is nothing more calculated and designed to enslave a man than the fear of death. But the almond trees grow gray and white, and so too does human hair. So Solomon's own hair was no longer as colorful as it once was when he was writing this, and this is just the course of life. Some old people do dye their hair, but the real and authentically, you reach a certain age, it is gray and white, much as an almond tree. Grasshoppers are normally agile, but one of the consequences of growing old is loss of physical vitality. Much as a grasshopper, we can observe them in their own lifetimes becoming no longer agile, and becoming a bird. And so he's talking about the physical walking and maintenance and of physical health, and just sustaining life itself, that becomes a burden. You are no longer hopping young grasshopper, and your will for certain things, your appetite, your love for certain things dies as you die in proportion to your die. So what once thrilled you, what once excited you, what once moved you, what once motivated you, no longer can compel you to get up off the couch. Desire perishes, sexual desire and every other form of desire eventually and inevitably withers the older one gets. But there is some rest, there is respite, there is some relief, because we do have an everlasting home. So Solomon unequivocally affirms that this life is more than we have. There is a life after this life. We do have an everlasting home. We were made for eternity, and the Creator who put eternity in our hearts, 3:11, has created an everlasting home for us, and that's why He put eternity in our hearts. And there's going to be mourning on earth because we are dead, but we are in fact alive in heaven. We are only dead in the human and mortal sense, but we are eternally alive in our everlasting home. Before the silver cord is loose, or the golden bowl is broken, or the jar shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. These are fragile things. Silver cords used to hold golden bowls, and as much as a chain is only strong as its weakest link, so too did the whole thing shatter and collapse if there is one loose cord on the silver cord which holds a golden bowl. And Solomon is writing to rich people because only rich people could afford these things. So he's reminding them that death is no respecter of persons. It comes to the wise, it comes to the foolish, it comes to the righteous, it comes to the wicked, it comes to the rich, and it comes to the poor. And it comes to the old, and it comes to the young. So consider yourself fortunate if you are lucky enough to be old. And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. From the dust we came, and to the dust we shall return. As it was in the beginning, so too shall it be in the end. We read in Genesis 2:7 that Adam was remade from the dust, and science tells us that the ingredients in the elixir of our physical frame are more or less identical to that which exists in dust. So we do have a scientifically solid connection to the dust of the earth. So science does agree with theology, and theology, the object of theology, is the one who created science. But according to science, there is no afterlife, because there is no observable, no one has ever seen anyone live beyond the dead except for the 500 witnesses in 1 Corinthians who saw Jesus Christ raised from the dead, 1 Corinthians 15. But by faith we affirm that there is a resurrection, and our faith is a little fuller than Solomon's. This is the only verse in the entire Old Testament or Bible which speaks of a spiritual resurrection. Every other one speaks of the bodily. Now, the innumerability of the resurrection references in the New Testament, we cannot we cannot list them all. So the word resurrection never appears in the Old Testament, but the absence of the terminology does not diminish the reality of the concept. As early as Exodus 6:3, the Sadducees, who by the New Testament days, they denied angels, they denied resurrection, and they denied all books outside the Torah, outside the law of Moses. But the Master used the law of Moses, that passage specifically, the one that says, I am the God of the patriarchs of the Hebrew faith, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and he's saying he is the God of the living, with the implicit entailment that the patriarchs who died on earth are living up there with him. And then also, Psalm 16, David's father had a conception of the resurrection. What's remarkable is that Solomon appears to of a physical resurrection, as expressed in the 16th Psalm, the 17th. I think he speaks of seeing Yahweh, and also the 11th. But most fully, you will not let your Holy One see corruption, nor his body see the grave, I think. And then Job 19, 25, 27, he has faith that he will physically behold his Redeemer, who will judge the earth at the end of the age. He has faith in Redeemer he hadn't even met yet, who had not come yet. So if Job had the ironclad certainty of a Redeemer who had not yet come yet, how much more without excuse are we, when we know that he has already come and lived and died, and we shall see him in the end, as Job proclaims. Also, Isaiah 26:19 speaks of a bodily resurrection, and Daniel 12:2 and 3, they are bodily. But we don't want to get wrapped up in that. The important thing is that this life is not all that we have, and we do return. So our physical framework does return from the us, but it is more than our spirit that returns to God, who gives up. Once our eternal spirit, the spirit is the eternal, immortal element in us, returns to the eternal one. We are immortal, he is eternal. We are immortal in the sense that we have definitive date of origins, where he pre-exists time, he antedates time, he was in the beginning, from the beginning, and before the beginning. But he gives us perfected resurrection body, which are designed and able to withstand eternity, whereas the bodily frames that we now have are designed to decay and perish in accordance to the laws of physics and the laws of nature, but our resurrection bodies will endure beyond the grave. But because he only speaks of a spiritual resurrection, the words of Solomon, which end in the 8th verse, end as they began. He says much the same thing as he says in 1:2. Futility, futility, says the Qoleth. All is futile. In that word is encapsulated his state of frustration. He is a man on a mission to discover the meaning and purpose of his existence, and he comes back empty-handed. He tries everything. He hopes. He tries to discover, but he ends up empty-handed. Between everything that transpires under the sun, wisdom, pleasure, toil, wisdom again, and also money, power. They're all meaningless. There is no source of permanent satisfaction for our impermanent existence. But Paul says that if the resurrection is not true, then our faith is in vain, and our faith in the resurrection is what makes the futility of this world have a revolutionary reversal of quality and character. So these conclude the words of Solomon. Now is the anonymous editor-author. Who he was, we don't know, but he was an admirer of Solomon. That much he leaves. And besides being wise, Qoleth also taught the people in knowledge, and he listened and sought out, laid in order many proverbs. He's writing admirably of his life and legacy. He was a wise man, the central figure in the Hebrew wisdom tradition. Qoleth translates as preacher or teacher, and the Greek translation, Ecclesiastes, is closely connected, so it more specifically speaks of a called out assembly, and he was a teacher as well as a ruler of king, and so he taught people knowledge, and he listened and he sought out. So teachers have to listen, and they have to learn. Woe unto the teacher who ceases to be a student. We have to learn more, know more, in order to be able to teach more. And Proverbs was one of the marks and measures of his wisdom. According to 1 Kings 4:32, he recorded 3,000 proverbs. There are some in the book of Ecclesiastes, but a total of 678. Even so, we don't know the half of what he told out, but he had an innumerable treasure store of wisdom, and he was respected centuries after he lived then and centuries after he lived now. Solomon survives as the embodiment of human wisdom. Quoleth sought to find out the words of delight and the words of truth, rightly written. So he was sincere, he had pure motivations and he had pure intentions. He wanted to speak the right words, and wisdom literature has much to say about words. There is power in words, there is worth in words, there is meaning in words, there is substance in words. So words that bring delight are, of course, the wise man's object and pursuit and standard and ideal. But above that, we are not people pleasers or man pleasers, but truth. Truth is our number one concern. Wisdom is concerned with truth, not that which makes us delight, although there is delight in truth and genuine delight. So we don't want people to delight in lies. We don't want to flatter them, but we want to write them correctly, say them correctly. And he was even though he didn't write this actual book, but he did do some writing. He was a scholar and a student as well as a king. The words of the wise are like goads, and as nails driven by the master of collections. They were given by one shepherd. The words of the wise often sting. Goads are devices used to control and keep domesticated oxen, the physically strongest beasts, so they have to be goaded in order to have their strength utilized to our energies, and it's a painful process. So too does wisdom often sting, but the word of God has been likened to wine in that it initially stings, but then its medicinal effects, using wine to pour over wounds, as was the primary painkiller throughout human history. But all this collections, all the macrocosm of human contributions, at least in the Hebrew, they were given by one shepherd. They have the same source of wisdom, the omniscient one. The shepherd is capitalized here, so he is the shepherd of souls and the captain of our salvation, and the source of our wisdom, the fear of whom is the root and foundation of all wisdom, which we'll explain in greater detail in 2 verses. And besides these, my son, be warned, the making of many books has no end, and much study is a wearying of the flesh. There is such a thing as too much studying. This seemingly goes against the grain of wisdom literature. You can have too much knowledge, but in 118 he says, with greater knowledge increases grief. Much in the same way that we cannot spend all our times working and toiling without spending any time to enjoying it, so too should we not so wrapped up in studying that we just become insular, isolated beacons of enlightenment, but we have no life to speak outside of this. So, life consists in seeking the balance. Don't spend all your time wrapped up in books. Get out there in the world and live this wisdom and teach this wisdom. Let us hear the conclusion of the entire matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is to all mankind. The conclusion of the matter is the finalization of the answer which haunts Solomon is what isn't futile, what can give permanent value in a transient world, an impermanent word. And he says, fear God, have the correct attitudinal disposition to him. So the fear of God is the root of all wisdom, and it's also the root of all happiness and all joy and all contentment. And keeping his commandments. Now, this is the first time we read about anything about keeping the commandments. The book of Proverbs is covenantal, conservative, and conventional, whereas in Ecclesiastes, missing is the covenant name of Yahweh. He is referred to as Elohim, always and only. Also, the nation of Israel mentioned only in 112, which gives credence to Solomonic authorship, because he was the son of David who ruled from Jerusalem over the United Kingdom of Israel. But wisdom, the meaning of life isn't found out in knowing more and understanding more. It is in obeying what we know. So we may not know everything we would like to know, but he gives us enough that we need to know to obey, and we need to do it. For God shall bring every work into just judgment, including all that is hidden, whether good or whether evil. This is what it all boils down to. This is why this is the meaning of life, to obey what we know rather than to aspire for greater knowledge, because one day we have to answer to the life that we live, and we cannot say that he did not give us enough knowledge to know to be on the receiving end of his mercy as opposed to his judgment. Every work that we do, every idle word we speak, everything we do goes into judgment, whether it is secret, it is naked and transparent before the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful judge in the sky, and he can discern the quality and the characters of every good deed, whether it was good or evil. Much that we do, we think we do good and appears to the world to be good, but is in fact evil, and its true quality is naked and transparent before the omniscient one who must judge. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye bye.